In 1896, the Smithsonian ethnologist Jesse Walter Fuchs opened a burial cyst in northern Arizona and found something that did not belong to the story he had been sent to tell. He had come to the region to document Hopi and ancestral Puebloan sites for the Bureau of American Ethnology, cataloging pottery, kivas, and the stone architecture that had already become the accepted signature of Southwestern archaeology. Instead, wrapped inside a burial near Wupatki, he recorded a small cast copper bell, its surface worn smooth, its clapper still loose inside the shell. Fuchs noted it, sketched it, and moved on to the next site. He had no metallurgical laboratory to consult and no reason to suspect that the bell in his hand had traveled across a distance that would take modern trucks the better part of a week to cover. Decades later, when chemists finally analyzed bells like it, they found copper alloyed with arsenic in ratios that do not occur naturally north of central Mexico. The bell had not been made in Arizona. It had not been made anywhere near Arizona. It had been cast somewhere in West Mexico, carried north across a continent, and buried in the high desert, as though it belonged there. Fuchs filed his report and returned to Washington. The question his bell raised, of how metal cast 1,000 miles to the south ended up in a grave beneath the Colorado Plateau, sat unanswered for most of a century. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why that bell mattered, you have to understand that North American archaeology has, for more than a century, told two separate stories about copper. The first belongs to the Great Lakes. Along the shores of Lake Superior, in deposits found almost nowhere else on Earth, copper exists in pure metallic form, workable with stone hammers and fire rather than a furnace. People mined it there for thousands of years, beginning at least 4,000 years before the present, in what archaeologists now call the Old Copper Complex. The second story belongs to the south. In West Mexico, metalworkers learned an entirely different craft sometime after the year 800, casting copper into bells, tweezers, and ornaments using alloys and lost wax techniques never documented among the Great Lakes miners. These two traditions are treated in the literature as unrelated inventions, born centuries and a continent apart, connected only by coincidence of material. Fuchs's bell suggested something else. It suggested that whatever separated these two copper worlds on paper did not separate them on the ground. The Lake Superior miners left an imbalance of their own, one that has nothing to do with the Rocky Mountain corridor and everything to do with why archaeologists were primed to expect large-scale ancient copper movement in the first place. Researchers have offered estimates, some now disputed, that ancient extraction on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula removed anywhere from hundreds of thousands to well over 1 billion pounds of native copper over several thousand years, while the copper recovered from archaeological sites across the whole of North America amounts to only a fraction of even the most conservative of those figures. That imbalance, still unresolved in the eastern half of the continent, is the same shape of problem now showing up 900 miles to the southwest, at the other end of the Rockies, inside a completely different metal tradition with a completely different chemical signature. Two unrelated copper economies, separated by 1,000 years and half a continent, both left behind more evidence of extraction than of arrival. Between the Great Lakes copper fields and the cast bronze workshops of West Mexico stands one of the widest stretches of difficult ground on the continent, the Rocky Mountain corridor running from what is now southern Wyoming down through Colorado and into New Mexico. For most of the 20th century, this stretch was treated less as a route than as a wall, a reason two copper-working peoples could plausibly have never met. The mountains are real, the passes through them are also real, and they are older than most maps admit. Cochetopa Pass in the San Juan Range of southern Colorado carried travelers and pack trains across the Continental Divide for so long before recorded history that surveyors in the 1870s simply adopted the trail the Ute had already worn into the ground rather than cutting a new one. Ute trade networks reached east onto the plains and south into the Rio Grande Valley for centuries before Spanish contact, moving obsidian, shell, and hides along routes that predate any written record of them. The mountains that archaeology treated as a boundary were, to the people living in and around them, a country crossed on a regular schedule. By the middle of the 20th century, the cluster of evidence around Fuchs's bell had grown much larger. Copper bells identified as West Mexican in origin turned up at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, at Hohokam sites near modern Phoenix including Snaketown, and in the greatest concentration at a single site near the Mexican border called Paquime, or Casas Grandes, in the state of Chihuahua. Excavations there between 1958 and 1961, led by the archaeologist Charles de Peso, uncovered thousands of copper bells along with the remains of what appeared to be smelting and casting operations, macaw breeding pens, and ball courts, all features associated with cultures far to the south. De Peso proposed that Paquime had functioned as a trading post at the northern edge of a Mesoamerican economic network, staffed in part by traveling merchants he compared to the Puchteca described in later Aztec sources. Bells cast in the workshops he uncovered, and bells cast in workshops further south still, moved outward from Paquime along trade lines that reached as far as the Colorado Plateau, 600 miles to the north. The metal in Fuchs's Wupatki bell and the metal coming out of De Peso's furnaces were, chemically, the same story told twice. De Peso's argument did not survive its first contact with the rest of the field intact. Southwestern archaeology in the 1960s was built on a different foundation, one that favored in situ development, the idea that Puebloan, Hohokam, and Mogollon cultures had grown into complexity largely on their own terms, shaped by local environment and local invention rather than direction from a Mesoamerican center. Scholars including Emil Haury, whose own excavations at Snaketown had defined Hohokam archaeology for a generation, pushed back hard against any model that made the Southwest a periphery of Mexico rather than a place with its own history. The debate that followed was not about whether the bells existed. Nobody disputed the metal. The debate was about how much weight a few thousand bells could carry, and whether admitting a trade route meant admitting influence, and whether admitting influence meant surrendering a version of Southwestern history that archaeologists had spent decades building without reference to anything south of the border. What nobody on either side of that argument could easily explain was the gap in the middle. If bells were moving in meaningful volume from Chihuahua to the Colorado Plateau and beyond, the 600 miles between Paquime and Chaco Canyon should show some trace of the traffic passing through, caches, workshops, waypoint settlements, something beyond the bells themselves, arriving already finished at their destinations. Instead, the corridor through the mountains and high desert connecting the two clusters has produced almost nothing. A handful of bells at scattered sites, a scatter of shell material moving the opposite direction, and long stretches of country with no metal at all. Archaeologists have offered several explanations. Trade goods moving light and fast along relay routes leave a thinner trace than goods moving in bulk. Perishable items, feathers, hides, dye, may have made up the bulk of what traveled alongside the bells, and perishable items rarely survive 800 years in the ground. But the explanation offered least often is also the simplest. Nobody has looked as hard at the corridor itself as they have looked at its two endpoints. The mountains that connect Paquime to Chaco have never received anything close to the excavation attention given to either site, and a route can stay invisible for a long time simply because the people equipped to find it have been busy elsewhere. The corridor's silence has an institutional dimension as well as a geographic one. After the Antiquities Act of 1906 placed archaeological sites on federal land under government permit, excavation in the Rocky Mountain states came to depend on funding priorities set largely by universities and federal agencies concentrated on two things: ancestral Puebloan architecture in the southwest and Paleo-Indian hunting sites on the plains. Neither funding stream had much reason to underwrite survey work in the high country between them. The United States Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, which together manage most of the land the corridor crosses, have conducted compliance surveys ahead of roads, timber sales and pipelines for decades, but compliance survey is narrow by design. It answers whether a specific parcel needs protection before construction, not whether an 800-mile trade route passes beneath it. The result is a body of archaeological knowledge shaped less by where the evidence might be than by where the money already needed to look. The people who lived along and around that corridor did not need federal survey money to know it was there. Hopi and Zuni migration narratives, recorded by ethnographers including Fuchs himself and later by Frank Hamilton Cushing, describe long migrations from the south preceding settlement on the mesas, movements that pass through named places along the way rather than arriving from nowhere. These narratives have traditionally been read by archaeologists as origin stories, valuable for what they say about identity and cosmology, but treated separately from the artifact record, filed under belief rather than geography. Reading them instead as descriptions of an actual travel corridor, one that happens to run through the same mountains connecting Paquime to the Colorado Plateau, produces an uncomfortable overlap between two categories of evidence the discipline has spent a century keeping apart. The compositional case against coincidence has only gotten stronger since Fuchs's era. In the 1990s, the archaeometallurgist Dorothy Hosler, working at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, ran isotope and trace element analysis on bells recovered across the Southwest and compared them against ore sources in West Mexico. Her results match specific bell assemblages to specific mining districts in Michoacán and Guerrero with enough precision to trace individual production centers, not just a general southern origin. The bell Fuchs pulled from a Wupatki grave in 1896 now sits catalogued in the Smithsonian's collections, one specimen among several hundred bells recovered across the Southwest over the following century, most of them shipped east to museum storage long before anyone thought to ask what route had carried the raw copper and finished bells north in the first place. The metal has been studied more carefully than the road it traveled. What the evidence implies, if not confirms, is a north-south exchange system operating across the entire width of the intermountain country for several centuries, moving metal, shell, feathers, and very likely ideas about ceremony and status along a route that mountain geography made difficult but never made impossible. The high passes were closed by snow for part of the year and open the rest, which would have made the corridor seasonal rather than continuous, busy in late summer and empty by midwinter, a pattern that would leave exactly the kind of thin, intermittent archaeological trace researchers have actually found. It would also mean that whoever carried a bell from a workshop near Paquime to a burial at Wupatki did not necessarily walk the whole distance themselves. Trade goods in documented pre-contact North America typically moved through relay, passing from one community's territory into the next through repeated short-distance exchange rather than a single long crossing, which means the 600 miles between the bell's furnace and its grave may be not one traveler's route, but dozens of overlapping local ones, stitched together into a single line only when a map is drawn after the fact. Colorado's high country holds physical evidence of exactly this kind of long-duration human presence, even where the copper trade itself has not yet been traced through it. Stone game drive systems, long alignments of rock cairns built to funnel elk and bighorn sheep toward hunters waiting at a kill site, have been documented above tree line in the Front Range and the San Juans, some radiocarbon dated to more than 5,000 years old. These structures prove sustained, repeated use of the high mountains across thousands of years by people who knew the terrain intimately enough to build for it. If hunters return to the same ridgelines generation after generation to drive game, there is no obvious reason traders moving bells and shell would have avoided the same corridors. And yet the survey attention paid to game drive systems, largely because they are visible from the air and easy to photograph, has not been matched by comparable attention to the lower valleys and passes where a trade route would actually run. That gap between what has been surveyed and what has only been theorized is where the copper road currently exists, on paper, in isotope reports, in bell counts tallied at either end of 600 miles of country nobody has walked with the question in mind. The evidence at the endpoints is not in dispute. What happened in between remains, for now, an absence with a shape. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Paquime itself remains only partly excavated. Di Peso's team opened a wide stretch of the site between 1958 and 1961, recovering an estimated 4 million artifacts before funding from the Amerind Foundation ran out. But large sections of the settlement, including areas near the ball courts and the suspected smelting district, were left untouched when the excavation closed. Much of what was recovered was catalogued, boxed, and shipped to the Amerind Foundation's research center in Arizona, where a portion remains in storage without complete analysis to this day. The bells that did make it into published studies are a fraction of the total recovered. The rest sit in drawers, sorted by site and burial number, waiting on a research question specific enough and funded well enough to justify reopening them. At Snaketown, the Hohokam site Hori spent decades studying. The copper bells recovered sit alongside evidence of one of the largest canal irrigation systems built anywhere in pre-contact North America, a network of channels stretching for miles across the Gila River Valley, engineered with a precision that required generations of accumulated knowledge about grade and water flow. A society capable of building and maintaining that kind of infrastructure was also, demonstrably, a society capable of managing long-distance trade relationships, receiving finished bells from workshops 600 miles to the south, and, in some cases, apparently producing simple copper items of their own, using techniques distinct from the West Mexican casting tradition. That detail rarely makes it into popular accounts of the bell trade, which tend to frame the Southwest purely as a receiving end for Southern technology. The archaeological record instead shows something closer to a two-way relationship, goods and knowledge moving in both directions across a corridor that connected two copper-working traditions long assumed to have nothing to do with each other. Turquoise moved in the opposite direction, and its trail is even easier to follow than the bells. Deposits at Cerrillos, in what is now north-central New Mexico, supplied blue-green stone worked by ancestral Puebloan miners for centuries, and work turquoise from that same source has been identified in elite burials as far south as Chichen Itza in the Yucatan and beneath the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, thousands of miles from the mines that produced it. If Mesoamerican metal was reaching the Colorado Plateau, Colorado Plateau turquoise was reaching the heart of Mesoamerica, moving along a network wide enough and old enough to carry stone south and cast metal north for the better part of 1,000 years. A trade relationship that lopsided in only one direction would be unusual on its own. A relationship documented moving both ways, with archaeologists on each end studying their half of it largely without reference to the other, is the kind of pattern that survives in the record specifically because nobody has tried to draw the whole circuit on a single map. None of this required a deliberate cover-up to remain hidden for as long as it did. Archaeology in North America organized itself, over the course of the 20th century, into regional specialties with their own journals, their own conferences, and their own graduate programs, Mesoamericanists on one side of an academic boundary and Southwesternists on the other, each trained to read a different body of literature and cite a different set of predecessors. A scholar spending a career on Hohokam irrigation systems had little professional incentive to also master the archaeometallurgy of Michoacán, and a scholar studying West Mexican shaft tombs had equally little reason to track survey reports from the Colorado Rockies. The corridor connecting their two research areas fell into the space between two academic departments, unclaimed by either, unfunded by both, and unexamined for exactly the reason most genuine gaps in the historical record go unexamined. Nobody's job depended on closing it. Cochetopa Pass, the corridor the Ute used to cross the continental divide for centuries before it appeared on any surveyor's map, sits almost exactly on the most direct line between Paquime and Chaco Canyon, continuing north toward the Wyoming basins, where Great Lakes copper trade eventually thinned out into the plains exchange networks archaeologists have mapped in more detail. Whether that alignment reflects a real corridor of use or simple geographic coincidence, given how few practical routes exist across that stretch of the Rockies in the first place, is a question nobody has tested directly. Testing it would mean surveying the pass and its approaches specifically for evidence of long-distance trade rather than local hunting and travel, a project distinct enough from both Southwestern and Great Plains research priorities that it has never been proposed as its own study. Chaco Canyon has already produced a real, unexplained road system of its own, one long accepted by archaeologists without full agreement on what it was for. Beginning in the 11th century, Chacoan builders constructed wide, engineered roadways radiating outward from the canyon, some cut straight through terrain where a curved path would have been far easier, extending in places more than 50 miles before disappearing into open desert without an obvious destination. The Great North Road is the most studied of these, but segments running south and southwest have received far less excavation, in part because they cross a patchwork of private, state, and tribal land that makes systematic survey difficult to coordinate. Nobody claims the Chacoan roads were built to reach Paquime specifically, but a culture already capable of engineering 50-mile roads through open desert, for reasons still debated, is not a culture that would have found 600 miles of mountain travel to northern Mexico logistically out of reach. The precedent for large-scale purpose-built movement across difficult country already exists in the same canyon where Fuchs's Bell has its closest known relatives. Rock art panels documented along several of the historic Ute travel corridors in the Gunnison and Uncompahgre river drainages add another layer to the question, though one that has to be handled carefully. Petroglyph and pictograph sites in this part of Colorado include figures and geometric forms that predate confirmed Ute presence in the region, layered beneath later Ute additions in a way that shows the same rock faces were returned to and marked by different groups across long stretches of time. Some researchers have proposed that certain panels functioned as waypoint markers along known travel routes, a use documented ethnographically for rock art elsewhere in the West, though no study has yet tied a specific Colorado panel directly to the copper and Macaw trade moving through the region. The honest state of the evidence is that the rock art proves repeated human presence along these corridors across a very long span of time. It does not yet prove what, specifically, was being carried along them in any given century. There is also a chronological problem sitting underneath the geographic one, rarely discussed outside specialist literature. The old copper complex miners working Lake Superior's native deposits were casting nothing at all. They were cold hammering pure metal, and they had stopped large-scale mining by roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era. More than 1,000 years before West Mexican metalworkers began casting alloyed bells using lost wax techniques that appear to owe more to South American metallurgical traditions carried north by sea than to anything happening in North America at the time. The two copper traditions are separated not only by the width of a continent but by a gap of well over 1,000 years, which is precisely why mainstream reconstruction treats them as unconnected. But separation in time does not require separation in memory. A route used by Ute traders in the 12th century did not need Lake Superior mining to still be active for the route itself to already exist, worn into use by centuries of exchange in goods that had nothing to do with copper at all, before the West Mexican bells started moving north along it. Fuchs never made the argument that later researchers would make about his Wupatki bell. His field notes describe the object in careful, restrained language, its diameter, its casting seams, its position relative to the body it was buried with, and nothing more. He had no compositional analysis available to him, no way to know in 1896 that the metal in his hand had been mined and cast 1,000 miles away. What he preserved was simply the fact of the bell's presence, recorded with enough precision that a chemist working a century later could still test it against a database of West Mexican ore sources and get an answer. That kind of restraint, documenting an anomaly without explaining it away, is easy to overlook as a form of evidence in its own right. But it is often the only reason an anomaly survives long enough for someone else to eventually explain it. Copper was never the only good moving through this exchange. Scarlet macaws, native to the tropical forests of Mexico and Central America, and incapable of surviving a Colorado winter on their own, have been recovered from burials and room deposits at Chaco Canyon in numbers that only make sense if live birds were being transported north repeatedly over generations. Paquime itself contained the remains of dedicated adobe breeding pens, walled enclosures built specifically to house and breed macaws for export, the only confirmed macaw breeding operation of its kind found anywhere in the region. A macaw cannot walk a mountain corridor on its own, and a live bird moving 600 miles north through mountain country in a container, fed and kept warm the entire way, took a level of logistical commitment that a few loose bells moving through casual exchange would not. Whoever managed that transport managed a supply chain, not a scattered trickle of trade goods passing hand to hand by accident. Interest in the connection has not disappeared, even if it has never sped up into the kind of coordinated survey the corridor would require. Archaeologists working under the broader label of Southwest and Northwest Mexico studies, a subfield that has grown slowly since the 1990s, specifically to bridge the divide DePeso first identified, continue to publish compositional studies tying individual bells to specific ore sources and specific workshops. Conferences bringing together Mesoamericanist and Southwesternist researchers now happen periodically, something that would have been unusual in Hori's era. What has not followed is dedicated fieldwork in the mountains themselves, the literal middle distance between the workshops and the graves, where the physical evidence for how the goods actually traveled would have to be found if it exists at all. Surveying the corridor properly would require resources that have never lined up with the question. High-altitude fieldwork in the Rockies is expensive and short-seasoned, workable for perhaps 4 months a year before snowpack closes the passes again, which means a single field season can cover only a fraction of the ground a coast-to-coast highway crew could clear in the same window. Funding agencies weighing competing survey proposals have historically favored sites with already documented significance, Chaco, Paquime, Snaketown, over speculative fieldwork in country that has not yet produced a single confirmed trade site of its own. That preference is defensible on its own terms. It is also precisely the kind of institutional logic that guarantees a genuine gap in the corridor's history will keep being deferred to the next funding cycle indefinitely, since the absence of evidence in an unsurveyed stretch of mountains can never compete on paper with evidence already sitting in a museum drawer 800 miles away in either direction. Modern tools have at least made the search more possible than it once was. Airborne LiDAR survey, capable of stripping away forest canopy from a digital elevation model and exposing subtle ground disturbance invisible from a hiking trail, has already revealed unrecorded structures and trail systems in wooded terrain across the eastern United States that centuries of ground survey missed entirely. The same technology has been used sparingly in the Colorado high country, mostly for fire management and forestry rather than archaeology, and has never been flown specifically along the suspected line between Cochetopa Pass and the Chaco Basin with this question in mind. The tool that could finally test whether a road exists in that stretch of mountains already exists. What has been missing is a reason and a budget to point it at that particular 600 miles instead of somewhere else. For now, the mountains keep their answer to themselves, the way they have for the better part of a century and a half. The Ute trails are still there, worn into rock in places no highway ever needed to follow. The bell is still in its drawer in Washington, and the 600 miles between one copper world and another remain exactly what they have always been on the official record, a stretch of empty country that nobody has been paid to walk with the right question in mind. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.